Hi, everyone, and welcome. Um, I wanted to start off by thanking you all so much for joining the lecture today. I'm Lucas, and I'm currently a fourth-year environmental design student at UBC Sala. And just before we begin, we wanted to first acknowledge that we are virtually gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. And with that being said, I will hand it off to my co-host, Jenny.
Thank you, Lucas. Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny. I am also a fourth year environmental design student at Sala. I'm very excited to be your co host for this exciting lecture. So, sitting here with us today, we have Vishaan Chakrabarti, founder of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, which is an architecture firm based in New York. He is also currently the Dean of College of Environmental Design at University of California, Berkeley, and the author of a acclaimed book, A Country of Cities, a Manifesto for an Urban America. He designs and advocates for sustainability, attainable, and equitable urban future centered around human connectedness, which is incredible. So we are very excited to have you here today. So just before we begin, for those who are watching, thank you for being here. Any questions you may have, please send it in the Q&A section, and we will bring them up at the end of the presentation for discussion. So without further ado, Vishaan, I will pass it on to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Jenny. Thank you, all of you, for the very kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I love the fact that you're also a College of Environmental Design, which it's one of the great pleasures of being the dean at this school, because environmental design, I think, is kind of an old term, but it's coming back. And I think it's even more important in the times we live in, given climate change and a bunch of other things we're going to discuss tonight. So I'm going to share my screen and we can kind of go from there. Okay. Great. So can everyone see the screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Okay. So, obviously we're in the middle of this pandemic, but what I think is really clear to me, and I think to many people, is it's really the tip of the iceberg in terms of what climate change will bring and the kind of changes that we're all facing, and especially younger generations are facing, um, given kind of the speed at which climate change is happening. And luckily, we now have a saner president in this country that just announced a bunch of climate actions just yesterday from the White House. Um, but one of my questions is like, what does design have to do with all of that? What does design and architecture in particular have to do with the kind of big issues of our era? And Mies van der Rohe said that architecture is the will of the epoch translated into space. And I think what he meant by that is that architecture is both a sort of mirror and a window into the big challenges of our day. And so when I think about those, and what this diagram kind of represents is, climate change first and foremost, social and racial inequity, which is one of the, I think, the other huge challenge of our day. And then underlying it all, that blue line, what that's supposed to represent is technological processing power and the impact that technology is having, both positive and negative, around the world in terms of social media and so forth. And these are three intertwined challenges in my mind. So I'm going to talk about kind of the relevance of both architecture and urbanism to these big challenges. And I'm going to start with a hero of mine. I don't know how many of you ever heard of Max Bond, who started the firm Davis Brody Bond in New York City. I knew Max when he was a bit older than in this photo, and I have to say, as a sort of young, starting brown architect in New York City, I didn't have a lot of mentors, and Max was definitely one of them. He was always a consummate gentleman. And he had a very, I think, expansive idea about architecture and about diversity and equity in the field. Um, so it's interesting when he talked about race, he talked not just about black issues or indigenous issues, or the term people of color wasn't really even used in a widespread way back then, but he understood that we were all sort of in it together. And he always used to lecture and talk about the street. And this has always been very important to me, this idea that the street is the building block of our cities. And if most people in the world today live in cities as they do, 70% of humanity will live in cities by 2050. um, if cities are sort of the building block for how people live in the world, then streets are actually the real building block for public space. And so there was this, he had this quote: "For a city of immigrants, the public realm is now more than ever the street." And to me, what's interesting about that is, when people think about streets today, throughout the 20th century, we think streets were invented for cars, but streets go back millennia, and streets and street grids have a powerful spiritual and social meaning that far transcend the automobile. In ancient China, the idea that as you move northward, it was actually a symbolic ascent towards the heavens. In ancient India, as you spiraled actually into the center, was how you found this kind of circumambulation that led you to a sort of spiritual center. And so, different cultures had different ideas about what the grid meant, but none of them were about cars or economics, but actually much more so about human connectedness and human interrelations. In ancient Greece, the plan of Miletus laid out by Hippodamus, and the idea that the equality of the grid was representative of the equality of citizens, although back then there were obviously, there was a very tight definition around who could be a citizen in ancient Greece. But the point is, the grid still represented this idea about equality. By the time you get to ancient Rome and the Roman Empire, the grid actually represents the empire itself. The laying out of the Cardo and the Deco, the north axis, the north-south axis, and the east-west axis, was actually a religious ritual. And it was said that wherever the Roman soldier was, he was in Rome because of the power of that ritual. The idea that the grid was what united this vast empire in a time before telecommunications. And so, again, this idea of streets and their sort of powerful social and cultural content. With the Spanish colonial empire and into Latin America, the laws of the Indies were an expression of the power of both the Spanish Empire and the Catholic Church. And we have many cities across North America that were still laid out according to the laws of the Indies. And then it's interesting, it's only by the time you get to sort of the mid 1800s, right before the Industrial Revolution, that you start to see streets and street grids laid out more for technology. So Barcelona, the street grid laid out by Cerdà, who was a civil engineer, and actually the chamfered corners of that famous, the Champlain blocks, were not actually to create more public space. It was in order to let a horse-drawn carriage take the corner faster and without stopping. So it's the first real example we have of the idea of streets laid out for efficiency for vehicles as opposed to this more spiritual content. And this then is, this idea is repeated through the 1800s in city after city. In Manhattan, Rem Koolhaas, of course, writes Delirious New York about the 1811 Commissioner's Grid and how those 800 feet by 200 feet blocks are laid out both for cars and for real estate. Not for cars, excuse me, for horse-drawn carriages and for real estate. And so what's really interesting about these early grids and the way they lay out streets is they work beautifully for the technology of the moment. Masonry construction, row houses, horse-drawn transit. But then soon after those cities are laid out, there is this extraordinary triumvirate of inventions. Otis invents the elevator, structural steel is invented, the internal combustion engine is invented. And this, by by the end of the Industrial Revolution and into the early 20th century, this completely transforms the cityscape, the idea of the street, and a lot of issues that then obtain in terms of climate and social equity. So what happens in sort of city after city is, like, the top row is the way in which the pre-industrial blocks pre-industrial buildings sat in the pre-industrial blocks. And then you see, with the invention of the elevator, with the invention of structural steel, that the post-industrial kind of building typologies sort of have to get shoehorned into the pre-industrial grid. And so that's why you see this almost kind of uncomfortable mix of these buildings mixing into the industrial grid. And of course, architecture comes up with an extraordinary solution, particularly in Le Corbusier, who says, we must destroy the street, we must tear down much of Paris. And in fact, the Athens Charter, upon which, Brasilia and other cities are based, actually has live, work, recreation, and traffic. Traffic actually has the same valence or currency as living, working, and playing, because Corb so values the automobile as a typology in the city. And so, whereas that doesn't happen in real life in those direct terms in Paris, it has a very widespread kind of relationship to what happens in the real world in terms of this belief in the car as the sort of driving force, no pun intended, for human settlement and human habitation. So in the 1950s, President Eisenhower passes the largest infrastructure act ever passed in the United States, which is to create the highway system, the interstate highway system, which is also used as a means for national defense in the Cold War, in terms of the ability to move intercontinental ballistic missiles around, but also is a huge part of the racial segregation that would come to kind of transform the American landscape after the 1950s, with what's known as white flight from American cities, just as the suburbs are sort of burgeoning because of this investment that the government's made. And of course, that turned into high art. You now have entire highway exchanges in North America that are the size of Italian hill towns in scale, because of this idea that the traffic itself cannot slow down. And so you actually have children thinking that this is a street, as opposed to all of those examples that I gave you before. And so this has an extraordinary impact that's still being unleashed upon the world. So when we actually say that more people live in cities than rural areas, there's a misnomer in that, in the fact that, like, I've been to many places around the world. These are 6 images of suburban subdivisions from 6 continents around the world. The world isn't really urbanizing. The world is suburbanizing, and it's suburbanizing at a rapid, cancerous rate, because as we approach, we're at 7 billion people, we'll be at 11.3 billion by 2100, according to the UN. The planet simply can't sustain 11 billion people entering the middle class, wanting big houses, living in irrigated deserts in sprawl. Not to mention how homogenous this is, where the street has lost all of its cultural and social value. Cities too, though, have become much more homogenous. This is 6 cities and 6 continents, and we now mass produce architecture in a way that's also resulting in this loss of the social and cultural value of the street. And a lot of that is attributable to a couple of factors that you find worldwide. To me, one of the most interesting things is the places people like to visit, and of course, this is a city that is sinking. But one of the things that's so interesting about a place like Venice, which, even though you might think of it as touristy or however you might think of it, is one of the most experimental cities humanity's ever built. And what's interesting about that experiment is everything that you're looking at in this photograph is illegal for us to design as designers. The railing is illegal, the staircase is illegal. If the gondolier hits his head on the bridge because the bridge is too low, he sues the designer. Everything about this is not possible because of the sort of regime of codes we have. And in fact, right after the Industrial Revolution and after the elevator is invented, we actually had this lovely way of building density around the world. And you found this typology of the cage elevator maybe about 30 apartments wrapped around that elevator in one staircase. Neighbors knew each other in this kind of assembly. This too, everything is illegal. Fire codes, two means of egress, none of it works in terms of building urban residential buildings today. So what we have today is instead, well, first of all, we have global capitalism, which basically homogenizes everything, windows, steel, where everything's made. So you have these products being distributed around the world as the world urbanizes. But you also have international building code, which says that, all for good reasons, for everything from, people in wheelchairs to fire code to a bunch of other codes. You now have the need to have, multiple elevators, multiple staircases. When you have that kind of infrastructure, you have to connect it up with these hallways that are like long and anonymous. You get the double loaded corridor. And then what you end up with is the same thud, the miserable thud of the same exact homogeneous residential building being built again across 6 continents with almost no differentiation because of the efficiencies associated with those codes and where a developer is trying to squeeze out money. And so you have this very difficult situation right now where streets and the buildings that sit upon the streets are all losing their social and their cultural value. Um, and what concerns me about that is that's all transpiring at exactly the moment when we have all of this political division happening in the world, and where cars are actually serving to segregate rather than bring people together because of their very nature as these sort of rolling tin cans. Um, and it gets in the way of something that's fundamentally important, I think, to the idea of the street and to the idea of urbanism. And there was a Greek city planner named Konstantin Doxiadis. He had this theory that he laid out that then an Indian architect, Charles Correa, made these diagrams of. And he had this idea that, every once in a while, say in a farming village, there was this person born that he'd call a blue person who felt, different than everyone around them. An iconoclast, a geek, whatever you want to call that person. And so that person then tried to find other people like themselves, people who thought differently about the world. And so they went to denser and denser environments seeking out that difference until they finally get all the way to the far right when they're in cities and they find other people like themselves. And the interesting thing in the diagram, you'll notice, is that as those people start getting together, they start changing the people around them. And it's basically Doxiadis' theory of how social progress or human progress occurs. And if you think about um, whether it's the Black Lives Matter protests or the Arab Spring or Tiananmen Square, this is actually how cities work and how change happens in society through the sort of networking of people in public space and how they kind of progress ideas. This is also a very important idea to the economy. We have data that shows that as people are in denser circumstances, and in cities in particular, that patent creation increases, innovation increases, with the kind of serendipitous collision of ideas and people in public space. This is also a critical idea for the ecology of the planet, because we know that even though cities are urban heat islands, on a per capita basis, people have far less carbon emissions when they live in apartments versus single family houses, when they use mass transit in the form of buses and subways, as opposed to living in suburbia. So there's just this natural way that if you have more and more people on the planet, if they live in more suburban circumstances, you have just a much higher carbon load for those people than if they live in more urban circumstances, which doesn't mean that everyone has to live in a skyscraper. You notice even in the middle, that idea of the townhouse density, is also, depending on, how dense it gets and what kind of transit is available, can also really reduce carbon load for the planet. Um, but, as designers, we have to think about more than the empirical data. And as environmental designers and architects, we need to think about space in the environment. And The other impact that cars have is, and I don't care whether they're autonomous cars or Uber or Lyft or electric cars, that doesn't matter at all. The key issue is how much space they take up. So you see on this slide that's to scale of the fact that in a bus it's about 9 square feet per person. In the car it's about 55, and you see pedestrians and bikes in between. And so what that does is it takes up a tremendous amount of space in the city. And so that's why you'll see many people pushing for a more bikeable, walkable cities. At the same time, I'm worried about, this one size fits all solution that some people come up with. Uh, it scares me when there are books that call Copenhagenize something. I was born in Calcutta. I love Calcutta. It's nothing like Copenhagen. Copenhagen's a lovely place, but not every city in the world should be like it. And so, we have to be careful about that, not just in terms of like imposing a kind of social agenda, but also the tremendous inequity that it can inadvertently cause. We have data that says the more walkable, bikeable environments are actually becoming some of the more unaffordable environments. It's where a lot of gentrification is occurring. And that makes sense, right? Because it is a more attractive environment. Once you've lived that way and don't have to get in a car to get a quart of milk, you'll find that it's attractive, and that's going to drive up prices in these places. And so we have to be really careful about this idea of that one size fits all solution. So I think in the thinking about, the future of cities, especially coming out of the pandemic, I think it's important to go back to some basics about, the human condition. Most human beings are bipeds. Most people need light and air and protection from inclement weather. We're subject to the forces of gravity. But there are a lot of things that are changing with technology. We're seeing the blurring of work and home. That's probably going to really rapidly progress with the pandemic as people start working in hybrid environments and spend more time working at home. We're seeing in that middle image the sort of ground scraper, the idea that a lot of companies want more horizontal kind of floor plates in terms of creating visual connectivity. And I do think autonomous technology could play a very big role, not in terms of individual vehicles, but in terms of mass transit, minibuses, and so forth. And what that could do is start us thinking about a path towards rethinking the city in an almost back to the future kind of way, in terms of, if you think about all of those historical examples I gave you, um, there was much more public space attributed to human beings as opposed to vehicles in those pre-20th century examples. And so what's interesting, if you now think about the new technologies we might have, if you have autonomous mass transit that knows not to hit pedestrians and bikes and so forth, we could take the same space that we allocate to streets today and we could reallocate it to say new courtyard typologies, where we have a fundamentally different morphology, a different kind of urban fabric that defines the public realm. And so you could start to imagine a world where we don't have to think about all the spaces between buildings as roads for cars, but something that's a much more free-flowing idea of space for people in the way that was very true prior to the 20th century. Now, part of that is also rethinking what's the fabric that gets built around that in terms of things like housing. And so some of you might know this project. It's in North Africa. It was by Candelas and Woods, who are some of the founding partners of Team 10. And it's actually a remarkable, groundbreaking project because it's one of the first European modernist projects, even though it's in Africa, that argued that modernism should change for climate and culture. And again, sort of start building this idea of the social or the cultural kind of modernism. And it's interesting. This is a picture from 1959, which is the last meeting of Siam. That's Alison Smithson down there, down at the bottom of that sign. I've always loved this picture. But this is when Siam breaks up, and it breaks up because there's actually a split in modernism about what the modern project is about. Le Corbusier really believes in the idea of the international style of architecture that is more singular, coming from the hand of the artist, that gets sort of superimposed from place to place. And so actually, Korb reacts very poorly to this project because he basically says, we don't do this. We don't respond to climate and culture. We're about imposing a certain modernist signature. That's the whole idea of the international style. And so you see, this was his plan obis that never got built, but again in North Africa, it's a beautiful plan. It's also one of the most racist plans that's ever been drawn because it literally has bridges that separate the colonizer from the colonized. Korb has some really rough quotes about how the French colonial project and architecture can educate the Arab during this period. And really doesn't, he believes this idea and believes fully in the French colonial project, again, doesn't believe in the street, really believes in this idea that this European form of international style architecture is something that can be imposed on the world as a signature to educate the world. And we kind of know the legacy of that thinking, right? That idea that you can kind of build with the same signature from place to place, regardless of climate or context or culture, because it's about the architect in this version of what architecture represents. But I'm sort of interested in what the folks from Team 10 were interested in, which is this architecture that was more sort of place-based, had this kind of other social agenda associated with it. And this is an image of Pruitt-Igoe, designed by Yamasaki, a rather famous or infamous housing project in St. Louis. And many of you probably heard the story of Pruitt-Igoe, how it was torn down. And for a lot of people, it is an example of the failures of modernism. If you haven't, I highly recommend the documentary, The Pruitt-Igoe Myth. It was made by a former resident of Pruitt-Igoe who then goes out and interviews the original residents of Pruitt-Igoe. And you find a very different story when you hear it firsthand, who talk about the fact that it was actually a really miraculous, successful place when it was first opened, but that the St. Louis Housing Authority did a bunch of things that resulted in its failure. So this is probably the image that you're much more familiar with. And this image should never be shown without an understanding of its context. Again, this image has been used by conservatives as an attack on the public project and by liberals as an attack on modernism and warehousing the poor. And neither of those are a correct interpretation of what happened here. And again, I refer you to the documentary to talk about that more. But my point is just, in the United States especially, we have this idea of the public street, public buildings that exists all the way through the 1950s, through Eisenhower's passing of the Infrastructure Acts and so forth, until you get to the Civil Rights era. This is the demolition of New York's Penn Station's image around 1964. So remember what's happening in the United States in the mid-1960s. There's the Highway Act has created this racial segregation, and Black Americans in particular are insisting on their rights as equal human beings. It is still extraordinary to me that Black women don't get the right to vote in the United States until 1965, which is very close to when this picture is taken. And my point is that as that unfolds socially, the idea of what the public is changes in the American mindset. So the Make America Great Again slogan is about this return to the 1940s and the 1950s, when the public didn't include Black Americans, immigrants, and women in the same broad way that we insist that it includes today. And so the whole mission of public architecture basically changes, almost dies. And I think that's the fast forward to where we are today. This is our office in New York pre-pandemic, and so we're really interested in a different direction and kind of where Team 10 left off. And I think we're part of many architects around the world who are really interested in picking up some of that tradition and understanding it in terms of those big challenges that I laid out with that first slide in terms of climate change, social equity, and so forth. So we're about 5 years old, and one of the first things that we sort of laid out was what we do and what we don't do. And so we put out a very clear mission statement, and we said there's a bunch of stuff we don't do. We don't do suburban subdivisions. We don't do single family houses. We don't work for dictators. Not because we're trying to be holier than thou. We're not criticizing other people for doing what they do in their practices. It's just not what we do as part of our practice. And it's interesting, that's brought us some of our best people and some of our best clients. So our focus has been not just the sort of wealthy inner city, but a lot of the outer rungs, the deindustrialized part of the city. That's a sketch I did on the upper left from when I was a student, understanding that like deindustrialization was going to leave what I used to call a zone of discard, kind of this leftover, these brownfield sites in the edges of cities, which are now getting rediscovered because technology is changing this idea of a central business district, changing those concentric circles. We now have much more multinodal cities where we don't have one downtown anymore. So now there's gentrification pressure on those zones of discard, those old industrial areas within the city. So a lot of our focus, you've heard the mayor of Paris, who's one of my heroes, and Hidalgo talk about the 15-minute city. In the North American context, because we just have a larger landmass, I talk about the 20-minute city, but the idea is the same, that you can reach most of your daily needs, work, school, fresh food, healthcare, within a 20-minute walk in each of these nodes. And that's a lot of what our work focuses on and tries to understand how architecture plays a specific role within that urban paradigm, particularly in terms of how it relates to the ground floor, different infrastructures like mass transit, telecommunications, and so forth. When we started, we didn't have a lot of work. We did have this extraordinary thing with the New York Times where they asked us to participate in kind of a visioning of what could happen to our main train station. I won't go through this in detail. This is the idea of recycling the arena that sits on top of the old Penn Station, which is the ruins that I showed you earlier from the 1960s. And we did this whole idea of like if you could move the arena and upcycle its structure and so forth, that you could take the current condition. So that this is the before and after, before and after, and it's when we did these advocacy projects that frankly we got a lot of attention for the kind of work that we wanted to do, and that kind of launched us on our way. We just did another one called Not Your Car, which is a whole visioning of what Manhattan could be if you ban private cars from all of Manhattan, because the space that cars take up in Manhattan is 4 times the size of Central Park. And we did this whole thing, there's a lot more of this online, of what our streets could be if we recaptured them for people, and got rid of private cars and created not just bike lanes, but much easier, movement for people in wheelchairs, for seniors and children, created much better kind of receptacles for solid waste management, and that, in Park Avenue could recreate the old median strip as an actual park, up in Harlem, that communities could get engaged in terms of fresh food, homeless services, other things that could happen, because it's an enormous amount of space. It's about a third of Manhattan is street, and then along the river. So and then this would basically completely transform the region's commutes, and so these advocacy projects were really important for us. And so, but we wanted to do actual architecture and urban planning work for clients as well. And, one of my heroes in school, Kevin Lynch, I'm sure many of you have heard of him, actually comes out of the Team 10 tradition. So some of our first real work was a big master plan for the Domino Sugar waterfront in Brooklyn, and now we're working on putting an office building, a sort of creative office building in that old sugar refinery. This is interesting. It's a heritage building. Used to have all of this crazy sugar refinery equipment in it. And so my initial thought was to insert like a new building into the old building. Um, and that's what the building used to look like. This is what's under construction right now. So this is a shot in the building. You're actually outside. You're inside of the existing exterior wall, the brick wall, but you're outside of the new curtain wall. So this is under construction right now. And we were very inspired by old industrial work. So I won't go through this in detail. The point that I really wanted to make with this, and we had to quote Semper, I'm just trying to move ahead, yeah, to this slide. So um, the ground floor of our work is always critical because we're trying to, again, understand how the buildings relate to the street and how do they offer something back to the public realm, going back to what, Max Bond talked about, what Kevin Lynch talked about. And so that's that under construction. And then in terms of housing, so Catherine Bauer was one of the two founders with William Worcester of our college. And she was a fascinating woman, wrote the 1937 National Housing Act for FDR. We just renamed our building Bauer Worcester Hall after her. And she studied architecture as well as urban planning. And even though she was a houser and focused mainly on housing policy, she was pretty tough on architects, and this quote I love. She said, "Many have forgotten or never knew that modern architecture was once primarily concerned with social and civic improvement." And so, it's ideas like that. This is a project that we're doing that's 100% social housing for one of the poorest parts of New York City. This is a church. This church lost 109 parishioners to COVID. And so, the pastor who is our client is trying to rebuild this community after the devastation of all of this. And so this is just the context, just an initial slide. So we're building 2,000 units of social housing, everything from supportive homeless housing to workforce housing, several acres of new public space, a school, and a performing arts center. And the pastor's read his Jane Jacobs, so we're trying to do the good urban things in terms of multiple street entrances and so forth. And again, that idea of complete streets, but not in that Copenhagenized way, something that we're working with the community on. The local community, the local council member very much wanted brick, felt it was something that local builders could build. That's the Performing Arts Center off in the distance there. And so very interesting kind of typology or sets of typologies in terms of what this housing will bring. And then finally, Aldo van Eyck, also part of Team 10, whatever space and time mean, place and occasion mean more, which was this idea that space and time are abstractions, place and occasion are about human habitation and use, how people actually manifest themselves in physical space. And so just a last project here, which is the capital of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, where we've been asked to design an urban village in the heart of downtown that's completely walkable, no cars, mixed use program. And what was so interesting about this project was the client said, we're still mountain people as Mongolians, and we like to get lost in the rural environment. We're nomads. And so city life is still something we're getting used to. And I drew him a picture that looked something like this, about the tradition of the flaneur, of the sort of urban nomad. And so the whole partie of the project is based around this idea of getting lost in the city. And so we created this kind of candy box of this typologies, of there's a folk theater, there's a haunted house, believe it or not, and laid them out on the site. There's a series of these kind of campfire moments that are being designed by Jamie Carpenter, the glass artist. And so, Mongolians are pretty tough people. They'll go out in the middle of the winter. And so these areas are actually designed to be sort of sustainably heated with like these surfaces would actually be warm to the touch using waste energy from the buildings. And then the actual materiality and construction techniques all flow from what is local. All local materials. They tend to use very bright colors with a lot of their buildings. A lot of it is concrete frame with brick infill, and then we wanted these solid, massive shapes because it's so cold that we really need. You don't want a lot of thermal loss. But there's nothing. Only the temples have these kinds of landscapes that you can walk through. So the mayor and the community was very excited about actually having a walkable hangout space in the heart of the city. So that's basically some of the projects I wanted to show you in the context of the larger kind of social forces that we talked about in the beginning. So with that, I'm happy to stop the screen share and answer questions.
Thank you so much for the incredible presentation. I think, there's so much to learn from what you talked about and take in. But I think personally what I found most fascinating was sort of to see your ideas and how you can sort of transform what's already existing in a city or a space and sort of addressing what's already existing. And also the renders that you guys were producing were really, I guess, like sort of, you can feel the emotion of the feeling of the space. So I just think it was really nice to see. So yeah, we would like to open it up for discussion and questions. So feel free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom, and Jenny or I will sort of ask any of the questions on your behalf.
Great.
Well, I guess I can start off the discussion with my question that I have. So you proposed a lot of solutions of how to make cities more livable and design cities of the future. And as we transition to new technologies, what happens to the old methods of transportation? And is there a way we can still incorporate it into our lives and don't let that go to waste?
Well, I mean, a lot of this is up to your generation, and you got to decide whether you want to drive around in these old gas guzzling tin cans like the generations before you did. Because here's the thing: the streets can be recycled. That was part of what our project for the New York Times, called "Not Your Car" was. Like the streets can easily be reused for all sorts of things. So we're not wasting that infrastructure at all. But cars don't have a very long lifespan. They're actually fairly horrible for the environment in terms of getting rid of them. But the point is, I don't think it's worth using that mobility solution simply to keep the cars around. Look, in some places, there's a lot of rural land in the United States and Canada and China and India and Brazil where you're going to need a car for the foreseeable future. My question is, why do we need them in the downtowns of our cities? And I think that in the next 10 years, you're going to see most major cities ban cars. It's already happening, which doesn't mean all cars. I mean private cars, right? There'll still be some form of ride share. There'll be, goods delivery and, all that. But I just don't think you're going to see a lot of private car use because cities can't afford it. They can't afford the space.
For sure.
Okay, there's a question in the chat, or in the Q&A. As urban design comes into being a profession of its own to bring architecture and urban planning together, what skills do you think urban designers can gain to be ready for the challenges of tomorrow?
Great question. Well, first of all, I think it's important to excavate the term urban design a little bit, because that actually emerged a bit out of the fact that physical planning, which was a thing back in the 60s and 70s, because of all the urban renewal that happened, became became sort of almost politically incorrect. And then urban design is now back with a vengeance because, we're building cities from scratch in a lot of countries in the world, especially in East Asia. But we have to rethink a lot of our existing cities. And Lucas, I really appreciated what you said about, the fact that in our work, we're really trying to understand the existing, like almost like an archaeologist. Real urban design is really hard and it requires a lot of skills to answer the question. Meaning that, yes, of course, you've got to learn design and spatial dynamics. You've got to learn how cities work, which includes their politics, communities, everything, every scale of government, right? Because federal governments are involved in infrastructure, state governments have a lot of control, or provincial governments, local municipalities. So you got to have an ear towards politics. Understanding kind of climate science and how climate affects cities is super important. And so, just what I'd say is stick with it. It's a great field. I love being both an architect and an urban designer, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience to become a really good urban designer because the issues are so complex.
Sure. Next question is, what do you think the role of design students and young professional is in making positive change in the early stages of our careers?
Um, Super good question. And let me answer it with a little bit of a paradox that I discuss with my students here all the time. And this is the paradox as I see it. I'm really encouraged. Part of why I still teach and hang around universities and not just practice is because I just love hanging around students. I think students bring all sorts of extraordinary, fresh ideas, and they push us old folks to kind of think differently, which I think is great. In students today, I notice a tension, which is, a kind of impatience about changing the world, and they should be impatient. I mean, if you look at the climate crisis, if you look at what's going on with race and equity, there's so many things. Dr. King talked about the fierce urgency of now, right? And so there's reason to be impatient. At the same time, architecture and urban design, as we were just talking about, are really complicated fields, and learning what you're doing takes tremendous patience. And so a lot of what you have to do when you come out of school is learn. And some of it might feel like a grind, but remember, especially as architects, when you're a licensed architect, you're responsible for human health and safety and welfare, right? So, I mean, I sign drawings that say that the building's safe, right? And so you don't want to go there unless you're really confident that that drawing is right. And so that takes a long, long time. I'm 55 years old. I'm still learning what it's like to be a good architect. And so to me, the fundamental challenge that students have graduating from, these fields, these disciplines, is this kind of yin and yang, this kind of tension between patience and impatience. And it's not about being one or the other. What I'm arguing is you've got to be both, and that's really hard. So I'm totally encouraging you to keep up your impatience, keep up your sense of urgency about the problems of the day, but don't let that then cloud. I was talking to a young student the other day, and she said, well, I had this internship and I learned that I really don't want a boss. And I'm like, flag on the play. Like, that doesn't work. Like, you gotta learn. You can't just graduate and suddenly be the superstar. It just doesn't work that way. It's too complicated, right? And so it's finding this balance, right? And just the last piece on this, I would just start by, you graduate, go and work in places where you do feel like you can learn, but that you also believe in, right? Where you may not agree with everything the boss is doing, but just at least believe in the overarching mission of the place and feel like you're doing work that you can feel proud, that you're proud of, that you'd be happy to take your parents to, or your boyfriend or your girlfriend to, that's important. But again, it's that struggle between patience and impatience.
Thank you for that advice and feedback. There's another comment and question. Thank you for a great lecture. I'm curious, given that your approach to design is so focused on an idea of the public good and of working with communities, what are your thoughts on architecture school, particularly on final thesis project as the endpoint / pinnacle of the professional art curriculum? And how do we prepare students for collaborative practice models like your own?
Um, Let me think about this a second. Um, I'm just reading the question because I'm not sure I understood one piece of it. Okay. Um, on your thesis project, look, here's the thing: school's fantastic, right? If you're not enjoying architecture school, you're in the wrong profession, because architecture school, like, it's really hard for things to be as good as they were. Like, I never left school. I thought studio is the best thing since sliced bread. I couldn't get enough of it. I still can't. Um, your thesis should be one of the most personal things you ever do. And what I'd really encourage, my dad died a month before thesis started, and he had this life. He was an eye doctor. He had a lifelong dream to build an eye hospital in India. And so for my thesis, I designed the eye hospital. It was this amazing thing, because it's this idea of like this place where people who are blind recover their eyesight. And I thought, for architecture, what an extraordinary thing. But it was also, for me, a healing process. Like, it was really deeply, deeply personal. And I just think you don't get to do that very often. You're not going to graduate and go to work for one of the firms like we just talked about, or for a government or a nonprofit or whatever, and do something that's that personal, because it's not about you. When you graduate and you go to work for that firm or that nonprofit or whatever, it's not about you anymore. And it's not going to be about you for a long, long time. And so I would definitely use the thesis to kind of think about who you are in this profession, what's your position, what do you want out of this, and use it to work that out. And a good architecture school should really help you channel that. And so, but I think architecture school is just great. Like, it's just, it should be really fun. And if it's not fun, I really suggest transferring, because right, because it's just not an easy profession.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think Sala's like very stressful, but still really fun for sure.
Yeah.
Another question we have from Carter is, I love how you create, or sorry, I love how you center communities and people within your design work. I was curious how you reconcile the sometimes contradictory needs or wants of human and non-human actors within these urban landscapes.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a tough question, and I don't have an easy answer for you. Look, here's the thing: I really believe in community processes, and every project we do, even the Mongolia project, is done in a democratic circumstance. I don't do any work for dictators. I don't do any work where there isn't kind of stakeholder buy-in and input. And there isn't because I just fundamentally believe that architecture is a public act, and that I don't look at those processes as bureaucratic. I look at them as, we are serving the communities in which we work, and so we have a responsibility to that. But that doesn't mean that you're going to make everyone happy, and communities are wrong sometimes. I mean, we've seen in cities all across the United States where communities don't want affordable housing, don't want homeless shelters, have a lot of like racial issues with mixed income housing. And so there is this mix of where like expertise matters. It just isn't this black and white thing of top down versus community control. There's a middle ground that's about listening to people, but also understanding that you need some kind of a filter, right? Which is a lot of what your training is about. And when I was saying make your thesis personal, it's like the understanding, like, what's your position in the field, right? And like when I showed the like what you do and what you don't do, I'm not asking anyone to agree with us, but what will you do and what won't you do? And like, if you had to write down that list, and I would encourage all of you, right, to just write down in your sketchbook, what would you do and what wouldn't you do as an architect, right? Because it's important to understand where you stand if you're then going to go into the lion's den of community board meetings, and because you have to understand where your own internal rudder is in order to go do that work, because it's hard work. I love it, but it's hard work.
I think I like in all of your responses sort of how you're sort of addressing, I guess, like your personal stance and position on it, because that is really what's important too about like doing something that you feel is right to yourself. So I really appreciate how you sort of always tie it back to that. Um, there's another question. Thank you for the presentation. Could you please expand on why the Copenhagen model cannot slash should not be applied worldwide?
Just because not every place is Copenhagen. I just look. That's just the mistake of some modernism all over again, which is to say we have one model and it's going to work for everyone. Um, you know, uh, in some places have a scale where biking everywhere makes total sense. Other places you really like take a city like London. London is enormous compared to Copenhagen. And sure, can you bike for local trips? Absolutely. But London is absolutely enormous. You need the tube, you need functional mass transit. It isn't just this one thing. And so I just get really worried about it. And there's also you got to think about the racial underlay, right? If urban designers, urban planners, and architects are going to walk around the world saying everything has to emulate Northern Europe, right? That's really scary, you know. So, like, look, there's a flip side of it. I went to China in the early '90s, and China had some of the best bike infrastructure I'd ever seen in the world. Most of it's been ripped out in favor of the car, but some of the most beautiful street sections. They had bike superhighways in a way that looked nothing like Copenhagen. It was very, very bike heavy, but it was bike infrastructure. Like it was totally different than what you see in the Scandinavian countries. So it's really important to not have one size fits all models. And this is this thing, like going back to the last question about community control, you know, you can't just assume that every community wants to be Copenhagen. And people are going to push back on that. And especially when you get into communities of color and stuff that have very different cultural underlays. So you just have to be really, really careful about that. Oh, I've got the answer, it'll work everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely not a thing that you can replicate throughout the whole world just because there's so many cultures and so many identities, for
Yeah.
sure. Mhm. All right, so we are getting close to the end here. So I want to ask if, Vishaan, if you have any closing comments.
Uh, Only that I just really appreciate the invitation and the questions. I just really encourage you to keep on doing what you're doing. Environmental design is a great degree for the undergraduates. For the graduate students who I think are in professional degree programs, it's fantastic. But like I said, it's a long road,
Mhm.
this set of disciplines. It's fantastic, and it's been one of the most rewarding things that I could ever imagine doing with my life. I just think it's really, I gave all of that history before I presented our work because everything we do sits in that context, right? Like, you know, all of us are sort of archaeologists at some level in terms of understanding what came before us. And so I would just encourage everyone to locate themselves in that history and that trajectory.
Yeah, I think that's something where both me and Lucas are learning in history class with Sarah Stevens is like you have to really know the history of everything before you can apply it to present day, for sure. Yeah. Okay, amazing. So we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk about such important issues and some great advice that's coming from your own personal experience. So big thank you for your presentation, answering all of our questions as well. It's been a very engaging talk. And we wish you the best of luck in your coming endeavors. And thank you and have a wonderful week, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.